welcome to Gita-From-Zero. This is our second session on the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Let me get things set up here. Back a slide. So we are Bhagavad Gita Part 2 today. So these are the items that we're going to discuss: the flow of Chapter 1, the conch shells being blown. We'll talk a little more about free will because it's a central issue at the very beginning of Bhagavad Gita. It helps to understand that, then everything else starts to make sense. But of course most people believe in free will, but it's worth thinking about it a bit. So then we'll talk about violence in government. All right, so we'll start off here with, this is the overall flow of Chapter 1 of the Bhagavad Gita. I've said it before, but the Bhagavad Gita starts off with Sanjaya and Dhritarashtra speaking, but the camera goes off them right away, you know. Dhritarashtra is in Hastinapur, Sanjaya is in Hastinapur in the palace, and there Sanjaya is able to, like television, see the entire events going on in the battle or the beginning of the Battle of Kurukshetra as if he was viewing them. Oh, Kilananda. So that's how it starts off, with Dhritarashtra and Sanjaya speaking. And then Sanjaya explains to Dhritarashtra that his son Duryodhana is speaking. So Duryodhana first assesses the Pāṇḍava army, saying various things about it. We discussed that last week. Then he assesses the Kaurava army, and he feels his own army is going to be superior. So that's what happens. We have done that last week, that section. Today we're going to do where the conch shells are blown. And then next week we'll talk about Krishna driving Arjuna's chariot between the armies, and finally Arjuna's doubts. So this is how Chapter 1 kind of gets laid out. Sanjaya and Dhritarashtra, Duryodhana assessing first the Pāṇḍava and then the Kaurava army. Then the conch shells are blown. Then Krishna brings the chariot between the armies, and at that point Arjuna reveals his doubts. So this is our section today. We're reading 12 through 19. This is Chapter 1. Chapter 1, 12 through 19. And this section has to do with the conch shells being blown. Then Bhishma, the great valiant grandsire of the Kuru dynasty, the grandfather of the fighters, blew his conch shell very loudly, making a sound like the roar of a lion, giving Duryodhana joy. So, as we just said, Duryodhana was first of all assessing the Pāṇḍava army, then he assessed his own army. And after that, then he mentioned that Bhishma was the important pivotal figure on the battlefield, and everybody should be careful not to let their guard down, because he can do a lot, but also he's older, so the enemy might make advantage of the fact that he was older. So after saying that, then Bhishma blew his conch shell, as it says, making a sound like the roar of a lion, giving Duryodhana joy. 13. After that, the conch shells, drums, bugles, trumpets, horns were all suddenly sounded, and the combined sound was tumultuous. This is Duryodhana's army, the Kauravas. This is their conch shells being blown. Now, with 14, we go to the other side, to the Pāṇḍava army. On the other side, both Lord Krishna and Arjuna, stationed on a great chariot drawn by white horses, sounded their transcendental conch shells. Prabhupada makes a point of the fact that in 12 we hear about Bhishma sounding his conch shell, but it's not described as transcendental. on 14, when Krishna and Arjuna are sounding their conch shells, and the Pāṇḍava army, their conch shells are described as transcendental. So Lord Krishna blew his conch shell called the Panchajanya, Arjuna blew his, the Devadatta, and Bhima, the voracious eater and performer of Herculean tasks, blew his terrific conch shell called Pāṇḍra. So this is 12 through 15. Now we'll do 16 through 19. So King Yudhishthira, the son of Kunti, blew his conch shell, the Ananta Vijay, and Nakula and Sahadev blew the Sugosha and Manipushpaka. That great archer, the king of Kashi, the great fighter Shikhandi, Drishtadyumna, Virat, the uncomfortable Satyaki, Drupad, the sons of Draupadi, and the others, O king, such as the mighty armed son of Subhadra, all blew their respective conch shells. So everybody's blowing conch shells. The blowing of these different conch shells became uproarious, vibrating both in the sky and on the earth. It shattered the hearts of the sons of Dhritarashtra. So we're getting into omenology here, that the fact that when the Pāṇḍavas blew their conch shells, it shattered the hearts of the sons of Dhritarashtra, portends that they're going to lose. So this great battle, where there was like 600 million people on the battlefield, and it lasts for 18 days, and absolutely almost everybody is killed at the end of this battle, except for about 20 people that survived the entire battle of Kurukshetra. So the Pāṇḍavas will win, and Dhritarashtra and his sons, Duryodhana and the other 99, will all die. And so this is the second section of the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Any questions about what we've just kind of discussed here? Yeah.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say,
that's
you
so
really
that
don't need
the
to.
folks in YouTube land can hear.
Got you. I just wanted to say, if you see me on my phone, I'm taking notes. I'm not texting. Just so
Okay,
you know.
okay.
I don't have a notebook. That's all.
Cool. We won't get out the ruler and yardstick and hit you over the knuckles. So, all right. So this is fairly easy to assimilate. There's no real heavy philosophy going on here. So what I wanted to do now is to move to going back to free will. We talked about free will last week, and we're going to talk about it again this week, because this is a very important concept. Actually, not just the Bhagavad Gita, but all religions, and in fact, even law, even social etiquette, everything is based on this idea that we have free will. You can't be angry at somebody if they have no free will. You know, if a computer, burns up, we can be angry that it burned up, but we can't get angry at the computer. The computer had no agency. So the Vedic scriptures, they make no issue about the fact that we do have free will. We are liable for things we think and say and do. Now, that does not mean that we have free will the same way that the Supreme Lord does, because the Supreme Lord not only has the ability to desire anything he wants, but immediately comes to pass, because he is the Supreme Lord. So if Krishna wants something, it immediately happens. Unless, of course, he doesn't want it to immediately happen, which sometimes he does as well. So this idea of free will means that we have the ability to desire absolutely anything. It can be good, it can be bad, it can be reasonable, it can be unreasonable, it can be good for other people, it can be bad for other people. In other words, we can want anything that we can possibly think of. However, that does not mean that we will be able to get it. And in matter of fact, that's usually the way it works, that according to karma and a number of other things, that when we desire something, we may not be able to manifest it in the actual world. Of course, we have sort of minor desires, like just wanting to move our hand, or wanting to blink our eyes, or wanting to walk across the room. Usually we can do those things, but there are people who have trouble with those things. So the idea of wanting and then of things manifesting is not a given. The Supreme Lord can want anything and actualize anything. We can want anything, but not necessarily actualize it. And of course, based on our choices in free will, we can go forward in spiritual life, becoming purified and becoming happier, and also becoming someone that helps other people and someone that is appreciated by other people. Or we can go the other way. We can become a very self-centered, very selfish and abusive person. And in this way, we become less aware of what's going on around us, and we become a menace in society. So this is the concept of free will, that according to what we do, we act, or according to what we desire, we act in the world, and when we act in the world, we create effects. Those effects can be good or bad. And karma is noticing exactly what we do and what we don't do, and we will get a reaction, but not right away. The reaction usually is delayed for some time, so we don't get a reaction right away. And now, 16 here I want to point out is losing free will through misuse and addiction. Because sometimes people can be said to have given away their free will. For instance, say someone is addicted to heroin or something like that. So in the beginning, they could choose whether to take heroin or not. But after a certain amount of time, if they become habituated to use heroin on a regular basis, it's hardly a choice anymore. It's between that and terrible withdrawal pain. So usually the person continues to use. And so this is the mechanism we call addiction. And when a person misuses their free will, of course heroin's an extreme example, but in general this same basic principle holds, that if we misuse our free will, we tend to misuse it again and again in the same way. And if we misuse it in the same way again and again, we become reduced to the point where we can no longer manage what we desire. When the appropriate situation is there, we will act on a bad impulse, a bad habit that we have cultivated. Questions about anything there? I'll give you a second to sort of think about it. There's a lot to free will. We'll see this slide again, and I have another slide coming up which has got more stuff on it. So most people accept that there is such a thing as free will. There are people who do not believe in free will, both atheistic and theistic people. Some don't believe in free will. So there is, for atheistic people, they usually think of free will, meaning that it's just an illusion. They think, and this is called determinism generally, that everything in the world is determined. We have a certain chemistry in our brain. We have a certain, setup in the electrical impulses in the way we think, and therefore whatever anyone does is already decided because of the nature of their brain. This is determinism, very hardcore determinism. Now, interestingly enough, there is a theological version of the same thing, where some people think that God has made everybody, and they're either going to make it or they're not, you know. And so this idea was there in the Old Testament that some people are the elect, it was called, and they're going to go to heaven. And then there's the non-elect, and they're going to go to hell, and that's just the way it is, and there's no changing it. Of course, the Bhagavad Gita does not accept that kind of predestination. It's also sometimes called predestination, which is interesting. There's another word we're going to talk about in a minute called predetermination, which is not exactly the same thing as predestination, but it has a similar notion to it. So in Bhagavad Gita, we will see that in the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, 63rd verse, this is toward the absolute end of Bhagavad Gita. Krishna, by that point in the 18th chapter, which is the last chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna will have explained the entire Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna. And then he tells Arjuna, have you heard what I've said? Now do what you wish to do. So Krishna is the Supreme Personality of God. He's explained Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna. And then he remarks, do what you wish to do. So he doesn't force Arjuna to follow what he says. He doesn't demand that Arjuna do what Krishna has just said. He leaves it open. And of course, with the next verse, Arjuna said, I've heard and I will act according to your words. So Arjuna accepts Krishna and he accepts the arguments presented in Bhagavad Gita. So at the very end of Bhagavad Gita, 1863, spoiler alert, we just killed the ending. Of course, you all probably knew anyways that Arjuna was going to accept what Krishna said. So also in Srimad Bhagavatam, in the 11th canto, 3rd chapter, 3rd verse, we have this verse where the Supreme Lord sent forth generations of higher and lower species where they could follow their either matra or atma, as it's said in that verse. So, abir bhutani bhutatma mahabhutair mahabhujaha sasarcha chabachani adyaswa matratma prasidati. So prasidati is facilitating. So living entities have a choice. They can facilitate, and the universe is poised at every moment to facilitate either our desire to become spiritually progressive or our desire to forget about spiritual life. And so we always have that free choice. And the universe will respond to either direction. If we decide we're not interested in spiritual life, the universe will cooperate with that. And if we decide we are, the universe will cooperate with that. There is some, slop and slosh there. It's not quite so cut and dry. But in general, if we consistently want to ignore spiritual life, the material universe will help us to do that. And if we want to develop our spiritual awareness, the material universe will help us do that. So we are free, and the material universe will respond to the way that we are acting, the way we're thinking. So that's later on, of course, later on Bhagavad Gita. And Srimad Bhagavatam is a different book altogether, a different group of books. So we've talked about some of these things now. Any questions there about any of that?
Thank you. In regards to determinism, I just want to clear up something I was thinking of. If a person has like a mental health disorder or something, is that considered determinism? Because it's not, it is?
Well, I'll have to get a little bit more detailed
Okay.
in there because there's a lot of nuances.
Yeah,
there.
I'm just curious. I'm always curious about how spiritualism and psychology work
Right,
together, you
right.
know. But yeah, thank you.
So the way that it works is that determinism, as we said, there's it's a idea that at one time was very popular, and everybody, all kind of philosophers, modern thinkers, and scientists believed that atoms and chemicals, they have one way of doing things, and the brain is just atoms and chemicals, therefore everything must be predetermined. If we knew how, this mathematician named Laplace, who was very famous, mathematician, once said that if we could know the details of where every atom was in the universe, and we knew all the laws of nature, essentially we would know the future in every detail. And of course, this sounded like a good line of reasoning, but a lot of stuff has happened since Laplace, so partly what poked a hole in it was the advent of quantum physics, where we can't predict what an atom does. We can predict what millions of atoms will do, because we have these, quantum physics gives us these probabilities of whether it'll do this or that or the other thing, So that's the nature of quantum physics. So if we can't exactly predict what one atom will do, then there seems to be some indetermination in the universe. So things could turn out multiple different ways. But not only that, later on, there was the advent of something called chaos theory. And chaos theory was this idea that some functions, mathematical functions, that describe the way things move or describe the way things evolve over time, very sensitive to tiny, tiny changes in their initial conditions. And if the initial conditions are just slightly different, the whole thing does something completely different. It's called they sometimes call it the butterfly effect, that a butterfly flapping its wings in South America causes a hurricane in New York City. It seems like, that seems ridiculous, but what it suggests is that if you actually look at the way it's mathematically described, that some things are very, very sensitive to slight variations in initial conditions. One good example is this, like, sort of pachinko pegboard, where you've got a steel ball that drops down, and there's a whole sort of cascade of little pegs, and it bing bong, bing bong, bing bing, bing bong, bong bong, bing bing, bing bing bong, And so if the steel ball connects with the first peg just slightly different, it will have a completely different trajectory than if it connects slightly the other way. So we can see that some things are just difficult to predict. Now, back to your question. So we're talking about determinism. Now, determinism is not such a solid concept in science the way it once was, say, 100 or 200 years ago. And not so many people believe it for several reasons: chaos theory, for quantum physics, a number of these kind of things that still, people who are very materialistic will tend to still believe in determinism. However, from the Vedic point of view, we see that everything is set up according to the laws of karma. That's the equation that modern scientists and modern philosophers tend to leave out. That things are not the way they are because of random situations. A person is not born in one country because of a random situation. Person is not born with a certain spiritual or material, not born with a material ability randomly, or for that matter, a material defect randomly. There's a reason behind it all. It all has to do with something that happened in a previous life, and then therefore their body was designed in a certain way. However, the nature of spiritual life is that no matter what your debility is, you can still move forward in spiritual life. It's not dependent on your material situation. However, material things are dependent on your material situation. So that's why, the person who has, say, Down syndrome or some other mental deficiency, they may not be able to perceive the world the way that a normal person can. And so they may perceive some things but not other things. And yet they work out their own karma in their own sense, And the interesting thing is that when we do our time in a particular body, then we get the chance to go to another body and we get upgraded. So sometimes for a life or a particular set of years, person has to endure some kind of debilitating misfunction. But then later on, they will graduate beyond it again, because the process of reincarnation means going from one lifetime to another another lifetime. Person may not be able to fully understand religious principles in one body, but in the next body they will be able to. Or possibly they might be understanding more than we realize that they're understanding. And because of communication issues, we don't really understand to what extent they grasp or don't grasp things. So that's there too. So that's how I would respond to your question. All right, so let me go a little bit further here into free will. I don't want to get, without the concept of free will, there's no such thing as culpability. We can't blame anybody if they have no free will. So that means that the law courts, that means that all religions would fall apart. That means no one could say that somebody was acting poorly in society because they're just acting the way they act, And we notice that some people are generally have a lighter or more altruistic outlook in the way they think and act, and other people less so. That has to do with previous lives and habits, so we develop a kind of habit in one lifetime, and then when we come into a new lifetime, we pick up where we left off. So everything has a continuum, but because in Western thinking we don't consider the concept of reincarnation, we don't see that continuum. It appears that some people are, by their quote-unquote nature, more good-hearted or whatever it is, but we've cultivated these things. So we've talked a little bit about theological determinism, and we've talked a little bit about atheistic determinism. Again, determinism is the idea that if we knew all the details of how the atoms are arranged and we knew all the principles of physics, we could theoretically predict everything, how it's going to happen. That's determinism. Now, there's a thing called compatibilism, which is a strange sounding word. And so usually people who believe in determinism believe that you don't have free will, because the two are kind of an opposite. Either you have free will or everything is determined. If everything's determined, there's no free will. But there are many people who believe in compatibilism, which means that you could have free will and determinism at the same time. So some people, that's what's called compatibilism. Libertarianism is, and this is the philosophical thing, not the religious tradition. There's a religious tradition called libertarianism too, but I'm talking about the philosophical concept. So libertarianism means to believe that we do have free will, whereas determinism usually means to believe we don't have free will and that everything is determined. So free will is the basis of all fairness, law, religion, ethics, social norms, physicalism usually goes with determination and also with no free will, but not necessarily. Some people who are physicalists or materialists believe in free will, and they don't believe in determinism, so that's also possible. I wanted to mention, at least in passing, Benjamin Libet, who conducted in 1981 or something a famous experiment. They were psychologically testing people with electroencephalographs or something like that, some kind of ability to measure electrical activity in the brain. And the concept was to have the subject flip their wrists kind of suddenly and unexpectedly. And then they would see if there was any electrical activity before or after. And so there was the action potential, they called it. You know, they had a Bereitschreifenpotenzial was a German word that they used for it, but at any rate, this action potential could be seen a few milliseconds before the actual action took place. So in other words, apparently before the body moves, there is a buildup of some kind of electrical activity, and then the body does something. So that seems fairly reasonable. So the next step was to see if a person could suddenly decide, you know, the subject was told, okay, sometime in the next 2 minutes, decide to move your finger. And tell me the moment you've decided to move your finger. And the way they did that was they had a spinning little clock thing that was going pretty fast. And so the person would try to remember at what point the clock was when they decided, and then they measured it, and it looked like the action potential was already there before the person even thought they had decided to move their hand or finger. So this way, some people made a case for that. This says that free will doesn't exist because already the chemistry in the brain was doing something before the person even thought they decided, what to speak of moving their finger, before they decided to move their finger. So at any rate, there's a lot of back and forth on this experiment, and it hardly eliminates the concept of free will, because free will in such a narrow and restrictive experiment doesn't really prove much, because first of all, the electrical activity in the brain and in the body moves pretty slow. It's not, like we're used to computers. And in computers, audio files and video files, they move through electricity, and electricity moves at the speed of light. So these things are lightning fast in a computer. But in a human body, it's not like electrical wires. You have action potentials going down nerve fibers. And these nerve fibers, at the quickest, they go something like 265 miles an hour, or something, which sounds pretty fast, but it's nowhere near the speed of light. So the way our electrical system works is a lot slower than the way computers' electrical system works. And so this doesn't really tell us much. And of course, this is a sort of trivial case of using free will. And as we said, a person can gradually give away their free will by doing the wrong thing enough times that they develop a habit. So many times people fall into habits of doing things where they don't even think about doing something, they just automatically do it. So I just wanted to mention the experiment with Benjamin Libet. And so this gets into the mind-body problem. If a person feels that the only thing that exists is matter, then there's no such thing as the mind. There's only the body and the brain. And the brain is physical, the brain is chemical, the brain has electrical impulses. And therefore, there's no possibility of any free will or any agency or any consciousness. However, we all know that we have consciousness. And so this is a part of the problem that science does not deal with the full extent of material nature. They only deal with a certain subset. And so in Bhagavad Gita and in other places, we hear about those aspects of the material world, still material world, but they are not gross material, which is the only thing science understands. So there's a thing called subtle material. And then there's the spiritual realm, which is a whole other thing, way beyond both subtle and gross material. Questions about any of that?
I'm just curious about what the difference between the material and gross material world is.
Oh, okay. Okay. We have this in chapter 7 in Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, Bhumir apo nalo vayu kamana buhirevacha ahankara itiya me bina prakriti ashtada. So there are 8 material elements. 5 are gross and 3 are subtle. So Bhumir is earth, apo is water, anala is fire, vayu is air, and kam is ether. Those are what we call the gross material elements, and that's what science studies. They study the ether is kind of equivalent to our modern time-space continuum. The earth is solid items, water is liquid items, anala is energy of various kinds, fire, electricity, etc. And vayu is air or gaseous substances. So, in other words, that's what science measures and deals with. But there are 3 others, and that is ahankara, manas, and buddhi, which are ahankara is the false ego, manas is the mind, and buddhi is the intelligence. Now here, the mind is not the same thing as the brain. The mind is something different than the brain. And these construct of these 3 things, ahankara, manas, and buddhi, are called the subtle body. And in Sanskrit, that's called the linga sharira. And this thing, which is made of earth, water, fire, air, and ether, this is called the sthula sharira, the gross body. So when we're talking about the linga sharira, we're still talking about something material, but it's not the kind of material that modern technology recognizes. But this is the mechanism, the subtle body, which carries the living being from one lifetime to another. The linga sharira does not die when the gross body dies. Rather, it is the sort of escape capsule, that takes us to another lifetime somewhere else. And in some cases, a person does not get another gross body for some time, and that linga sharira is what we commonly say in the modern world as, we call it a ghost. So that is a subtle body without a gross body. And so this is the difference between subtle and gross. And so scientists don't have to be afraid, if they're going to be materialists, of studying the subtle material energy. It's also material energy. Spirit is all beyond that. It's a completely different category. Okay. So there's much more to be said about these things, and as we go through, we may go back to it. But I wanted to kind of give us an overview of some of the issues we've come across so far in Chapter 1. We haven't really gone through all of these yet, but in the very beginning, in the purports, Prabhupada talks about how to understand the Bhagavad Gita in the Association of Devotees. We hear about the importance of this place called Kurukshetra, where the battle is being fought. Dhritarashtra is worried that maybe his sons and the Pandus will make some compromise. He's hoping it doesn't happen. It won't happen. War will indeed take place. And Kurukshetra is a sacred place. We talked about some weeks ago why it's sacred, that King Kuru wanted to make a place where if anybody performed austerities there, they would go automatically to heaven. So eventually this came to pass, and that was Kurukshetra. Then we're going to hear about the justifications of the war. So first, Arjuna will, in next week's session, discuss why he thinks the war is a bad idea. So he'll discuss that in Chapter 1. And he'll continue discussing it in Chapter 2 at the very beginning. But later on, we will understand why Krishna is suggesting that Arjuna go on and go ahead with the war. Then we're going to discuss in next week's about the collateral damage of war, and we'll be discussing the meaning of life. This is all part of Chapter 1. We'll hear about duty. That'll happen a little bit more in Chapter 2, but we'll hear a little bit about duty. And then the use of lethal force, and we'll talk a little bit about ethics and morality, and we've already talked about free will. One thing I wanted to at least touch on today, we're running out of time here, is government. So government is an important organization of human society. The government is supposed to allow people to work together and suppress both threats from people who would destabilize society within the society, or people who would destabilize society coming from outside the society. So usually the government agents who protect within are called police, and those who protect from outside are called military. So the government has these two regulative wings. So Arjuna is in the military, so he is a soldier, actually. And government is supposed to understand the nature of what is right and wrong, what should be done, what shouldn't be done, what is aggressive behavior, what is justified behavior, and therefore government should act accordingly. And we'll see that the Bhagavad Gita does have certain conceptions of what a government should be, how it should work. And we're going to talk a little bit about family relationships and how they're important. And happiness and the ontology of life in this material world, that will be also one of the issues. So although Chapter 1 of Bhagavad Gita is a lot of narrative, we're hearing about the battle and what Arjuna is saying to Krishna. It doesn't get much into philosophy. It does a little bit in Chapter 1, but with Chapter 2 onward through Chapter 18, then we get in. The whole thing is philosophy. There's no narrative at all. There's no real explanation of much happening. It's all discussing the Vedic philosophy, various aspects of it, and of course we'll come to understand about Bhakti Yoga. So from chapter 1 through chapter 18, the entire Bhagavad Gita is spoken by Krishna to Arjuna. Arjuna is reluctant to fight in chapter 1, and in chapter 2 he takes shelter of Krishna. Then in chapter 18, Arjuna agrees with Krishna's reasoning and accepts the idea of continuing with the fight, and he begins the battle after that. So right after Bhagavad Gita is spoken, the actual battle of Kurukshetra commences. Any questions about that? So let's discuss what will be on the agenda for next week here. There we go. So next week we will talk about what happens now after the conch shells are blown, where Arjuna asks Krishna to draw the chariot between both armies. And then we have his decision not to fight, and we're going to talk about duty, love, freedom, and happiness. That'll be verses 20 to 27, and that'll be next week. Final questions or comments? So next week will be April 5. Wow, time flies. All right, so thank you all very much. Hare Krishna. Now I'm going to do my timing.